first well-documented anarchist experiments in education were from the sort of mid to late 19th century. And these were experiments by essentially libertarian thinkers, some of whom had clear connections with the mainstream anarchist, with the anarchist movement, others of whom I think were anarchist sympathizers but not really part of the movement. And I think that the way to understand it is as a critique and a challenge to the dominant forms of education which existed at the time. And it's very important to see this in a historical context, because even before national, sort of universal state education became the norm in most Western countries, the education that was available was almost completely controlled by, well, usually by the church, actually, but certainly it was a very top-down, kind of hierarchical and largely oppressive form of education, and it was for an elite. It generally excluded girls, and it was explicitly linked to an ideology that was on the whole nationalistic, religious, militaristic, depending on where it was. And so the first libertarian educators really wanted to challenge that by setting up a form of education that would be open to everybody, that would not educate children to develop a kind of loyalty to a particular state or monarch or certain similar sort of form of power, and that would, well, as they saw it, would encourage children to think for themselves. That was the crucial element of it, that education should be about allowing children to think for themselves. That vision is perhaps best articulated by William Godwin, who is some regard as sort of an anarchist, early anarchist thinker, 18th century British thinker, who was very, very suspicious of the idea of the state being involved in education before it even became a sort of, commonly encountered argument. I mean, before state education was even a reality, he saw it on the horizon and was very concerned about the way in which it would threaten individual freedom, diversity, and so on. So there were sporadic, sort of small experiments in libertarian education from the mid to the end of the 19th century, but probably the most famous anarchist schools were set up at the beginning of the 20th century. The most well-documented one that I came across was the modern school in Barcelona, set up by Francesco Ferrer, a Spanish anarchist. And this was set up at a time when Spain was completely controlled by the Catholic Church, really. And so the very fact that he was setting up a school that was, it was co-educational, that was considered scandalous, and that did not teach any religious dogma, as he saw it, that was seen as a huge threat to the authorities, and he was in fact hounded for the brief period in which the school existed, and, as it's well known, was eventually executed by the authorities. But that's perhaps the best documented early anarchist school with a very clearly thought out curriculum, a certain commitment to principles such as not having any system of rewards or punishments, no grades, and an idea that through education, which involved much more than just academic education, it was an early form of what Dewey later developed as education through doing. It was, active learning. The idea was that through this kind of active learning, children would develop the capacity to challenge the state system, to challenge the dogma of the church and other forms of dogma that they were presented with, the capitalist system, the colonial wars which were being waged at that time. And so children were taken out regularly on visits to factories and so on to learn about how capitalist economy functioned, to learn about the class system. They were encouraged to do things like grow their own vegetables, to understand about self-sufficiency and possibilities of governing their own community as opposed to be dependent on some external system. And I think every single aspect in the school curriculum, such as it was designed to challenge the dominant status, religious and militaristic ideology of the time.